They were the picture of black love, a power couple admired by all. A dream wedding. A perfect couple. But behind the smiles and vows lay a secret so explosive, it turned passion into vengeance, leaving the groom screaming in agony and the bride in handcuffs. How does a love story so promising end in mutilation and betrayal? What happens when the truth we fear the most is exposed in the most devastating way? Before we dive into this shocking case, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more jaw-dropping tales of love, lies, and betrayal. Taneisha Holloway was everything a man could want: brilliant, beautiful, and ambitious. At 29, she had built a name for herself as a powerhouse attorney in Atlanta, respected in the courtroom and admired for her unwavering confidence. Raised in a deeply religious household, she held firm beliefs about love and commitment. She wasn't just looking for a husband, she was looking for the perfect man. Someone successful. Someone loyal. Someone who could give her the kind of life she had always envisioned. And then came Rashad Wilkins. At 32, Rashad was at the peak of his career, an investment banker with a reputation for making money move. He had the charm, the confidence, the kind of smooth-talking presence that made people trust him without question. Tall, well-dressed, and always in control, he was the kind of man who turned heads when he walked into a room. But when he met Taneisha at a networking event in downtown Atlanta, it was her that had him mesmerized. Their connection was instant. Rashad was drawn to her intelligence, the way she commanded attention without even trying. Taneisha, in turn, was captivated by his ambition and confidence. He was a man who had his life together, who seemed to value success as much as she did. They exchanged numbers that night, and from that moment on, their relationship took off like a dream. Lavish dates at the finest restaurants, surprise weekend getaways, and social media posts that painted them as the ultimate power couple. To the outside world, they were perfect. A black love story straight out of a fairy tale. And when Rashad proposed, he did it in grand fashion, on the rooftop of a luxury high-rise, overlooking the city, with a diamond ring so big it caught the light from every angle. Taneisha said yes without hesitation, tears in her eyes, believing she had finally found the love she had always prayed for. But what Taneisha didn't know was that beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Cracks that no amount of love, money, or commitment could fix. Because Rashad had a secret, one that would turn their dream wedding into a nightmare no one would ever forget. Malcolm Tate, Rashad's best friend, had been a part of Rashad's life for as long as anyone could remember. The two met in college, inseparable from the moment they crossed paths. Malcolm was everything Rashad was: handsome, confident, and magnetic, but with an edge. He was the kind of man who moved through life like he had a secret no one else was in on, effortlessly charming anyone who came too close. To the world, they were just best friends, brothers in everything but blood. But behind closed doors, there was something deeper, something neither of them dared to name. It started 2 years before the wedding. One night. One moment of weakness. Rashad and Taneisha had been arguing, one of those explosive fights that left the air thick with resentment. She wanted more from him. More effort. More emotional presence. More of the man she had fallen in love with. But instead of working through it, Rashad did what he always did when life got too complicated. He ran to Malcolm. That night, the drinks flowed like water. One shot turned into 5, and before Rashad knew it, the words were spilling out. How trapped he felt. How he loved Taneisha but sometimes, something about it didn't feel right. How he wished things were different. Malcolm listened, nodding, his eyes holding something Rashad had never noticed before. And then, one moment changed everything. Rashad leaned in, seeking comfort. A touch, a reassurance, a way to silence the storm in his head. But instead of just a hug, Malcolm kissed him. And Rashad didn't pull away. That night should have been a mistake, one that both of them vowed to forget. But what started as a drunken lapse in judgment spiraled into something neither of them could control. It was never love. Not the kind Rashad claimed to have for Taneisha. But it was an addiction. A toxic, shame-filled obsession. Malcolm became the secret Rashad couldn't shake, the one thing he swore he'd leave behind every time he crawled out of his bed, only to find himself back in it weeks later. Rashad juggled two lives, lying effortlessly to the woman who thought she knew him best. He told himself it didn't mean anything. That Malcolm was just a guilty pleasure. That once he said, "I do," it would all stop. But Taneisha was no fool. She had always sensed that something about Malcolm and Rashad's friendship was different. At first, it was subtle, the way Rashad ignored her texts when he was with Malcolm. The way he'd cut calls short, his voice suddenly tense when she asked where he was. The way he got defensive whenever she questioned why Malcolm was always around. She wanted to believe she was overthinking. That it was just her own insecurities playing tricks on her. But then came the night she couldn't ignore. Her 27th birthday. The night was supposed to be perfect, champagne, music, the people she loved most. And then she saw them. Across the room, in a dimly lit corner, Rashad was laughing, his body swaying drunkenly. And then, in plain sight, in front of people too drunk to care, Rashad climbed onto Malcolm's lap, grinding against him in a way that sent ice through Taneisha's veins. For a second, she couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't do anything but watch as her fiancé, the man who was supposed to love her, moved on his best friend like a woman in the club. The morning after her birthday after party, Taneisha woke up with a pounding headache, but it wasn't the alcohol that made her stomach twist, it was the image of Rashad on Malcolm's lap, moving in a way no straight man should with his so-called best friend. She had barely slept. She spent the night replaying what she saw, telling herself she had imagined it. That the dim lights, the drinks, the atmosphere had made it look like something it wasn't. But deep down, she knew better. So, when Rashad finally woke up, groggy and reeking of liquor, she confronted him. What the hell was that last night? Her voice was steady, but her heart pounded in her chest. Rashad blinked, rubbing his face. What are you talking about? You and Malcolm. You were all over him, Rashad. In front of everyone. He laughed, shaking his head. It was just the liquor, babe. We were having fun, enjoying the happy moments. You're overthinking it. Overthinking it. The words cut through her, but they didn't silence the unease growing in her gut. Rashad wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close as if his touch could erase what she had seen. You know I love you. Come on, T, don't let one drunk moment ruin a good night. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that it was just the liquor. That it was just a stupid, meaningless moment between two friends who had partied too hard. But something in Rashad's voice felt off. From that day on, she watched them both carefully. Every excuse Rashad gave. Every glance Malcolm stole when he thought no one was watching. Every time Rashad's phone buzzed late at night and he tilted the screen away from her view. Taneisha didn't know what she was looking for. But she knew, without a doubt, she would find it. Then came the wedding 2 years later. The wedding was nothing short of a fairy tale. Held at one of Atlanta's most exclusive luxury hotels, it was a spectacle of black excellence, a breathtaking display of wealth, class, and elegance. The grand ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers, floral arrangements dripping in white roses, and a sea of guests dressed in their finest. Taneisha and Rashad were the perfect couple, the envy of everyone in attendance. From the outside, it looked like a flawless union, two successful, beautiful people committing to a lifetime of love. But beneath the surface, hidden between the carefully curated smiles and vows, was a truth so dark it would soon shatter everything. As the night wound down, guests toasted to the couple's future, dancing and drinking in celebration of their love. Taneisha soaked in the adoration, accepting compliments about her beauty, her grace, her perfect husband. But inside, a quiet unease settled over her. She had spent years convincing herself that the doubts in the back of her mind were unfounded. That the whispers of suspicion were just insecurities, that Rashad was the man she believed him to be. But tonight, something felt off. After the last of the guests had bid their farewells, Taneisha excused herself and made her way up to the honeymoon suite. She imagined Rashad waiting for her, champagne in hand, ready to start their first night as husband and wife. She smiled to herself, shaking off the nagging feeling in her gut. Then she opened the door. And her entire world collapsed. There, in the dim glow of the suite, Rashad was on his knees. His tuxedo jacket lay discarded on the floor, his hands gripping Malcolm's hips. His lips, her husband's lips, were wrapped around his best friend's erection. Malcolm's head was tilted back in pleasure, his fingers tangled in Rashad's hair, lost in the moment. The air in the room was thick with the scent of sweat, champagne, and betrayal. Taneisha didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, frozen, her mind struggling to process the nightmare unfolding before her eyes. For years, she had doubted herself. Questioned her own instincts. Ignored the red flags. But now, the truth wasn't just staring her in the face, it was gutting her from the inside out. Something inside her snapped. In a trance-like state, she turned and walked out of the suite. The distant hum of hotel staff moving about barely registered in her ears as she moved through the halls, her body running on pure instinct. Then, just past the catering area, she spotted it. A carving knife, resting on a food prep station. Her fingers curled around the handle. Without hesitation, she turned and made her way back to the suite. Rashad scrambled backward, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. His face was pale, his body shaking. Taneisha. I can explain, he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. It's not what it looks like. But it was exactly what it looked like. And there was no excuse that could undo what she had just witnessed. Taneisha stood motionless, the carving knife gripped so tightly in her hand that her knuckles had turned white. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out the frantic apologies spilling from Rashad's lips. Her perfect husband. Her forever. Her fraud. Her mind reeled, flipping through every moment, every lie, every ignored red flag that led to this very second. Malcolm had stumbled away, his bare chest rising and falling as he fumbled for his pants, eyes darting between Taneisha and Rashad. His hands trembled as he reached for his shirt, as if covering himself could somehow erase the scene she had walked in on. Taneisha, listen, Malcolm started, his voice low and cautious, like a man trying to calm a wild animal. You don't have to do this. But it was too late. Taneisha's breath steadied. Her expression became eerily calm. She took one step forward. Then another. Rashad's eyes widened in horror. He raised his hands in surrender, his entire body shaking. Baby, please. The knife flashed. One swift, brutal strike. A sickening squelch. A blood-curdling scream tore through the suite. Rashad collapsed onto the floor, his body convulsing violently. Blood spurted in thick, crimson waves, staining the pristine white carpet. His screams filled the air, raw, broken, inhuman. Taneisha stood over him, her breath steady, her grip unwavering. In her hand, she held it, his severed manhood, slick with blood, a grotesque mockery of the man he had pretended to be. Malcolm lunged toward her, eyes wide with terror. What the fuck did you do? She turned just as he reached her, her body twisting with precision. The knife slashed across his arm, cutting deep. Malcolm stumbled back, clutching his bleeding limb. His breaths came in ragged gasps as his gaze flickered to Rashad, who lay writhing, his blood pooling beneath him. The walls of the suite seemed to close in, the air thick with iron and betrayal. Malcolm bolted. Ripping the door open, he ran into the hallway, screaming for help. "Somebody call 911. He's dying." Chaos erupted. Hotel guests spilled into the hallway, their shocked gasps filling the air. A woman shrieked. A man cursed. Footsteps thundered down the hall as security rushed toward the scene. Inside the suite, Taneisha didn't move. She stood over Rashad, her wedding dress drenched in his blood, the knife still clenched in her trembling hand. The room was a massacre. Rashad's cries had turned into guttural, wheezing sobs, his body writhing in agony. Tears streamed down his face, his hands pressing against the gushing wound between his legs. His body convulsed, twitching in shock, his breaths shallow and rapid. Taneisha crouched beside him. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her bloodied hand and let his severed manhood slip from her fingers. It landed on his chest with a soft, sickening thud. She leaned in, her lips inches from his ear. "That's what you wanted anyway, right?" she whispered. And then, sirens in the distance. The end of her marriage. The end of her life as she knew it. Taneisha didn't resist when the police arrived. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply stood there, her wedding dress drenched in blood, her hands still trembling, as officers swarmed the suite with their guns drawn. "Put the knife down. Hands where we can see them." Without hesitation, she obeyed. The blade clattered onto the marble floor, streaked with Rashad's blood. Her eyes remained cold, eerily calm, as chaos erupted around her. One of the officers muttered, "Jesus Christ," taking in the gruesome scene, the man on the floor writhing, his body convulsing, the growing pool of red. That was when she finally spoke. "He humiliated me on my wedding night." Her voice was chillingly steady. "I just evened the score." They handcuffed her, led her out of the suite as Rashad's guttural screams echoed behind her. He was rushed into emergency surgery, doctors fighting to stop the hemorrhaging. But the damage was too extensive. Nothing could undo what had been done. The mutilation was permanent. The media swarmed the hospital, the headlines brutal. The once polished, confident investment banker was now a ghost of himself. His family was devastated. His mother, inconsolable. His father, too ashamed to even look him in the eye. His life, as he knew it, was over. Malcolm took the witness stand, his arm still healing from the deep wound Taneisha had left behind. He had once loved Rashad, maybe still did in some way, but as he took the oath, he knew he couldn't lie for him. Not now. She didn't say a word, he told the jury, his voice hoarse with emotion. She just did it. He described the horror, the blood, the agonizing screams that still haunted him. Despite their years of friendship, the secret moments they had shared, Malcolm testified against Taneisha. There was no justifying what she had done. The prosecution painted her as a jealous, vengeful woman who had planned her attack the moment she saw the betrayal. She could have left, the prosecutor told the jury. She could have screamed, cried, even divorced him. Instead, she chose the most barbaric form of revenge imaginable. The defense pushed a different narrative. She was in a state of extreme emotional distress, her attorney argued. She was humiliated, shattered, betrayed in the worst possible way. She reacted, not with premeditation, but with blind devastation. Taneisha showed little emotion throughout the trial. She sat with perfect posture, her expression unreadable. But the jury saw through any justifications. The betrayal was devastating, but the crime? Unforgivable. After weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Intentional maiming. Attempted murder. The judge's voice was heavy with finality as he delivered the sentence. This was not justice. This was rage. And for that, you will serve 18 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. There were no gasps. No outbursts. Just silence. Taneisha blinked slowly, then, for the first time since that night, smirked. She turned to Rashad, who sat pale and hollow, a shell of the man he once was. "I guess we both lost, huh?" she whispered. As the bailiff led her away, Rashad lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. Their love story had started with promise. It ended in ruin. Rashad Wilkins had once been a man admired by many. Wealthy, handsome, and successful, he had built a life others envied. But in the blink of an eye, everything he had worked for, everything he had carefully curated, collapsed around him. The story spread like wildfire. News stations dissected every gruesome detail. Social media turned his name into a punchline. Memes flooded the internet, mocking, ridiculing, turning his pain into entertainment. He avoided the outside world, unable to escape the humiliation. The man he had risked everything for, Malcolm, disappeared without a trace. Whatever love or passion they once shared was drowned in guilt and regret. Rashad's career, once soaring, took a nosedive. Investors withdrew. Clients walked away. His name, once associated with power and prestige, now carried whispers and side eyes. His colleagues no longer respected him, his bosses no longer trusted him. One by one, the doors that had always opened so easily for him began to slam shut. Women he once charmed now sneered at the mention of his name. His reputation as a smooth-talking ladies' man was gone. Replaced by scandal. By whispers of what he had done and who he had done it with. His family, mortified, distanced themselves. His father couldn't even look at him. His mother tried to be strong, but the shame in her eyes was unbearable. The perfect son she had raised, the pride of the Wilkins name, had been brought to his knees in the most humiliating way imaginable. He withdrew from the world, locking himself away in a penthouse he no longer had the means to afford. The walls closed in, the silence suffocating. Meanwhile, Taneisha sat in a prison cell, her fate sealed by one fateful act of rage. She was no longer the ambitious attorney, the polished professional, the woman who once had it all. She was inmate number 346729. But even in chains, she still carried an air of defiance. As she was led out of the courtroom, her smirk cut through the air like a blade. She met Rashad's hollow stare and leaned in ever so slightly. Hope it was worth it. She was locked away, but in a way, she had won. She had left her mark. Rashad, once the perfect man, now lived in the shadow of his own ruin. His power, his pride, his future, all destroyed in a single night. What should have been the happiest night of his life be? This case is more than just a shocking tale of love gone wrong, it's a brutal reminder of what happens when secrets fester in the dark. Rashad and Taneisha had everything, success, admiration, and a future that should have been filled with happiness. But beneath the perfect image was a betrayal too deep to forgive. Taneisha's rage turned their wedding night into a scene of unimaginable horror, an act that ensured no one would ever forget what she had done. Rashad lost more than just his manhood, he lost his dignity, his career, and the life he had built. And Malcolm, once a willing participant in the deception, vanished into the background, his name forever tied to a scandal too twisted to escape. In the end, no one won. Taneisha was behind bars. Rashad was a broken man. Malcolm disappeared into shame. And the love that had once seemed so perfect was nothing more than a lie that had cost them everything. But what do you think? Did Taneisha's rage make her actions understandable, or was this an act of vengeance taken too far? How should betrayal in relationships really be handled? If this story shocked you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more cases that expose the darkest intersections of love, lies, and betrayal.